Phyllis Magidson. I'm the Elizabeth Farron Tozer Curator of Costumes and Textiles at the Museum of the City of New York.
And I'm Susan Swimmer, a fashion expert based here in New York City. We're here to talk about the fashion of the 1960s. Phyllis, thank you for having me with you.
Thank you for coming.
What made you want to mount an exhibit on 60s fashion?
It's my favorite period, and curators are theoretically not allowed to have favorites, but it's my era as well. And we have an incredibly strong permanent collection of material from the 1960s. If you look at what is happening on the runways today, you will probably find evidence of everything that's currently happening having happened in the 1960s at one point or another.
Featured in the exhibit is the designer Bill Blass, a great American designer. Our special guest today is Chris Benz, the creative director of the House of Bill Blass. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about fashion, all things 60s fashion, here at the Museum of the City of New York. So during the 60s, were there stylistic moments of 60s fashion that you see being resurrected today?
Sure. When I think about the 60s, I think lots of color blocking. Really starting in the 60s was when women were the ones who were using their voice to determine what was cool and deciding for themselves what they wanted to use. And before that, they were really being spoken to by these sort of higher level designer characters. And I think that empowerment with fashion is really what makes the 60s so inspiring, and I think why every season the 60s are referenced in some way. This is really what I think of when I think 60s, is all of this.
Right,
you know,
right,
color
same.
blocking, checkerboard, mini dresses, you know, as much leg as possible with a flat shoe.
So good. So let's talk a little bit about Bill Blass, a personal favorite, someone who's featured in the exhibit here. Were there hallmarks of his design?
Bill Blass is kind of the father of American sportswear. It was about creating luxury in the everyday. It was about separates and great fabrics and great colors that could be worn all different sorts of ways and mixed up and matched back to things you already had in your closet.
I feel like he was able to dress a woman for every occasion of her life.
The Bill Blass vision was dressing a woman from when she gets up first thing in the morning until she falls asleep at night. And then beyond that, also filling in all of the blanks of toiletries and what car she's driving. He was really sort of the first designer to license that image in a way that felt really powerful and specifically American.
Okay, so then we get into the later 60s. A lot of experimentation, right?
A lot of textile. I love the mix of this period with sort of ethnic, traditional ethnic fabrics, and it was really about embellishment and...
I didn't realize that, I must admit to you. Like, I didn't realize that that was such a thing, but it was.
All different designers mixing all sorts of elements into one look.
And like mixing materials.
Absolutely.
I also, for me, it's just amazing how many different things came about in the 60s from a fashion standpoint. Like, I get it, super complicated decade. I guess it spoke to the changes in the way women worked and thought about clothes. People
were moving around the world and in and out of their jobs in a way that felt specifically different than the decades prior. When you think of the 40s and the 50s, there's this sort of regimented kind of propriety to the fashion, our sense of fashion, and then the 60s, sort of everything broke loose.
It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Absolutely.
Fashion of the 60s. So Phyllis, many people are nostalgic about fashion, and I think this exhibit tickles that fancy in people. Does this resonate with you?
Oh, very, very definitely does. You know, it was a period when people were really out there to put on a show. Right. And the clothing was very theatrical and spirited, and again, not in any tradition of clothing that had happened in the past.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. That's Fashion of the 1960s.